The house, nestled deep in the quiet Seattle suburb, had become a mausoleum. A year had passed since the sound of Ethan's laughter was violently snatched away by a careless red light runner, but the silence was still a physical weight, pressing down on my chest until breathing became a conscious, painful effort. I was Laura Mitchell, or what was left of her, a hollowed-out 36-year-old woman perpetually dressed in David's oversized, unwashed t-shirts. My world shrank to the four walls of our home, meticulously preserving the dust motes dancing in the shafts of sunlight that pierced the gloom. I hadn't cleared out Ethan's room. Not a single toy. My husband, David, was a ghost, haunting the edges of my grief. He'd leave early for the office, come back late, and avoid my eyes, and the house. His silence was loud, a constant accusation that I was somehow failing at grieving the right way. "You need to see someone, Laura," he'd whispered one night, his voice thick with a fear that wasn't about the loss, but about me. "He's still here, David," I'd replied, a serene smile touching my lips. "I feel him." It started small, an almost imperceptible tugging at the hem of my shirt when I was alone in the kitchen, a flash of shadow at the periphery of my vision, too quick to be real. Then, the sounds. One Tuesday afternoon, while I was staring blankly at an old photo of Ethan's toothless grin, I heard it, a faint, unmistakable giggle coming from the end of the hallway. It was exactly like the sound he used to make when I tickled him mercilessly. My heart didn't leap with joy, but with a terrifying, absolute certainty. He was back. I told David. I told him how the tiny music box in the nursery, which hadn't worked since the accident, suddenly began playing its tinny lullaby in the dead of night. I showed him the faint, dusty print of a child's hand on the drywall near the stairs. David looked at the wall, then at me. "It's dust, Laura. Or maybe you did it in your sleep. Please, for your own sake, stop this." His denial wasn't just frustrating. It was a wall between us, and I realized I would have to pursue this alone. My love for Ethan had become a blind, scorching desperation, and I knew deep down that the universe, or God, or whatever cold, indifferent entity governed our lives, wouldn't simply hand him back. I needed to take him back. The search led me to the darkest corners of the internet, old message boards, forgotten occult libraries, and eventually a mention of a spirit communication ritual designed not to observe a spirit, but to pull one across the veil using a personal anchor. It spoke of absolute commitment, of a life force exchange, and of a profound risk of inviting something else entirely. I didn't care. The night I chose was moonless and silent. David was asleep, the rumbling sound of his breath a comforting shield against my terrifying task. In the center of the living room, I drew a rough circle with chalk. Inside it, I placed 4 beeswax candles, Ethan's worn-out teddy bear, and the t-shirt he was wearing the day he died. The final instruction required a sacrifice, a binding agent of my own life. I used a small, sharp knife to prick my finger, letting 3 drops of my blood fall onto the center of the t-shirt. I began chanting the required words, a mix of Latin and something ancient and guttural, my voice shaky at first, then gaining a feverish strength. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of melted wax and ozone. The candles flickered violently, casting monstrous shadows that danced on the walls. Then a sudden sharp whoosh of air extinguished the flame. Silence. A heavier, denser silence than before. I felt a cold pressure on my chest, a profound sense of emptiness rushing into the space I had made. I stared into the darkness, trembling, convinced I had failed, or worse, summoned nothing but a deeper sadness. And then, I heard it. A tiny, delicate sound, like the whisper of dry leaves on pavement. It came from the hallway just beyond the edge of the lightless room. "Mama?" It was his voice. Muffled, slightly raspy, but undeniably him. I stumbled backwards, tears finally flowing, not of sadness, but of maniacal triumph. I had done it. When I finally dared to flick on the lamp, the chalk circle was undisturbed. Everything looked normal. except for the faint, powdery footprint of a small, bare foot just outside the chalk line, leading away down the hall. My breathing evened out. The cold vanished. An immense, unnatural peace settled over me. I smiled, a true, joyous smile for the first time in a year. "I told you," I whispered to the empty room. "You can't keep a good boy away from his mother." I had brought my son back. Or so I thought. The days immediately following the ritual were steeped in a strange, beautiful tranquility. The oppressive silence of the house was gone, replaced by a delicate, almost imperceptible sense of presence. Ethan was there. I couldn't see him yet, but I could hear his light footsteps padding across the floorboards when I was in the kitchen, and feel a cool draft whenever I turned around quickly. I even started cooking his favorite mac and cheese again, laying out his small plate at the dinner table. David noticed the change in me. I was laughing more, a low, contented chuckle that didn't quite reach my eyes, but it was a vast improvement. "You seem better, Laura," he said hesitantly one evening, watching me set the table. "I am," I smiled. "He's helping me." David still saw a grieving woman in denial. He couldn't grasp the tangible reality of the spirit I had summoned, and I realized the presence was exclusively mine. It spoke only to me, whispered jokes only I could hear, and seemed to actively avoid David's space. But the peace didn't last. It began when the spirit started demanding things, not toys or affection, but isolation. "Don't go out today, Mama," a tiny, raspy voice would hiss from the floorboards near the front door. "We can play here, just us." When David suggested a walk one evening, the air in the room suddenly turned icy. The lamps flickered wildly, and the small old grandfather clock in the hall began chiming at an impossible speed, its sound distorted and frantic. David dropped his keys and stared at the clock, confusion turning to genuine alarm. "What was that?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Just the old clock," I dismissed, though I could feel the spirit's cold satisfaction. The footprints on the drywall now appeared regularly, but they weren't faint or dusty anymore. They were often muddy, or sometimes strangely, stained with a dark, oily residue. The childish drawings I occasionally found scattered on the floor were no longer clumsy stick figures. They were intricate, frantic scribbles of black lines and disturbing wide, pupilless eyes. Then came the true horror. One night I was sitting on the edge of the bed when the presence, my Ethan, spoke, not in a whisper, but directly into my ear. "Mama, look at me." I turned, and for the first time I saw him clearly. He was 7, exactly as he was when he died, but there was a profound wrongness about him. His clothes were damp and smelled faintly of rot. And his eyes, they weren't the bright blue of my son. They were pools of deep, impenetrable black like holes burned into his face. The voice, when it came again, was a low, resonant rumble, a child's vocal cords struggling to contain a much older, darker sound. "You brought me back, Mama," the thing said, his smile stretching too wide. "I won't be alone now." Panic finally clawed its way through the blinding fog of my grief. This was not my son. I had invited something ancient and hungry into my home. David, now desperate, had made his call. Pastor Allen arrived the next day. The pastor was a kind, elderly man, hesitant but determined. "Laura, David is very worried. I want to help you both heal," he said gently, stepping into the living room. He didn't need me to confess. The air itself was a palpable weight of spiritual menace. Pastor Allen stopped short, his face draining of color as he looked towards the hallway. "Laura," he whispered, fumbling for the cross hanging around his neck. "This is not grief. This is a very powerful, very old darkness." The entity responded instantly. The windows rattled violently, and a framed family photo of the 3 of us, Ethan laughing in the middle, flew off the mantelpiece, shattering against the pastor's feet. Then, the final chilling declaration. The blackness in the air intensified, a booming, unnatural voice echoing from the walls, making the floor vibrate under our feet. It was the entity speaking directly to them, to the intruders. "Mama, you called me. Now I won't be alone. No one leaves." Pastor Allen scrambled backward, his face a mask of abject terror. He knew this was beyond his simple parish duties. He fled, promising to return with aid with the full power of the church. David, paralyzed by fear and finally confronted with the undeniable truth, tried to drag me toward the front door. "Laura, we have to go, now." I shook him off. My eyes met his, and he saw the peaceful, terrifying certainty that had replaced my sanity. I walked past him and locked the deadbolt, dropping the keys into my pocket. "No, David," I said, a serene smile returning to my lips. "He just told you. No one leaves." The house became a prison. David was still alive, locked in the master bedroom. I kept him there. The entity, my precious, terrible Ethan, demanded it. The black-eyed thing had taken full possession, not just of my home, but of my entire reality. My days were spent in a state of horrific, blissful delusion. I would sit on the rug in the nursery, singing lullabies to the chilling emptiness, waiting for the moments when the spirit would manifest. The sightings became more frequent, more real, and more grotesque. Ethan was gaunt, his skin stretched taut over sharp bone, but to me, he was beautiful. He was my son, and he was finally home. David's desperate pounding and muffled pleas from upstairs were merely background noise, the irritating protest of someone who couldn't understand the depth of a mother's love. The entity's presence was a palpable, stinking cold that settled into the furniture. It no longer used small tricks. It was actively, maliciously destructive. I watched, fascinated, as a porcelain doll exploded into shards merely because David had dared to mention my name in a prayer. The thing was purifying the house, making it ready for us. The sun was barely up when Pastor Allen returned. I heard the frantic, heavy pounding at the front door. He wasn't alone. I could hear the murmur of other voices and the frantic rattling of the knob. He had brought help, perhaps a priest, perhaps the police. I calmly walked to the door, my heart utterly tranquil. I knew they couldn't take my son away again. "Laura, open this door. We know you're in there." The pastor's voice was sharp, edged with fear and authority. "We're playing, Pastor," I called back sweetly, my voice muffled by the thick oak. "Ethan is finally asleep." There was a moment of silence, then the sound of splintering wood as the police, it must have been the police, began to force the lock. I retreated, not in fear, but to ensure my son was safe. I walked to the living room, where the ritual had taken place. The room was dark, but a single flickering candle, the last remnant of my terrible pact, burned steadily on the mantelpiece. I saw him then, clearer than ever before. He wasn't standing. He was resting. I walked to the antique rocking chair and looked down. My sweet boy was curled in the seat. He was skeletal, skin like dry parchment stretched over a tiny skull, and his body was curled in a fetal position. His mouth, however, was stretched into a wide, joyful, frozen smile, a monstrous expression of satisfaction that exposed too many teeth. He was finally still, finally mine. I reached down and carefully scooped the frail, weightless form into my arms. It didn't feel like flesh and blood. It felt like dry sticks wrapped in old fabric, but the cold emanating from him was the warmest thing I had ever felt. I sat down on the rug, cradling the gruesome thing, rocking gently. The front door finally burst open with a crash. Heavy boots stomped into the hallway. I heard shouting, then the sound of David's strained, relieved yell from the upstairs room. The first officer to reach the living room froze dead in the doorway. He was a huge man, but his face crumpled into a look of sheer, vomiting horror. The others flooded in behind him, policemen and Pastor Allen, who immediately dropped to his knees, clutching his cross and weeping. They saw the room. They saw the chaos. And they saw me. I looked up at their terrified faces. I was at peace. My mission was complete. The black-eyed thing had possessed me completely. turning my profound love into its anchor, my grief into its eternal home. As the officers moved toward me, slowly, hesitantly, I simply tightened my embrace on the bony figure in my arms. They read me my rights. They tried to take the body, but I held on fiercely, my strength unnatural and absolute. As they finally managed to pry me away, handcuffing my wrists behind my back, I looked back at the terror-stricken circle of faces, and I smiled, the perfect, serene, and terrifying smile of a mother finally reunited with her child. "I told you," I stated, my voice steady, calm, and utterly final. He came back. The air in the house was thick with the scent of old wood and settled dust, a sterile smell that always clung to places where great sadness had lingered. Coming back to my mother, Martha's, home in the Connecticut suburbs, even after her death, felt like slipping into a heavy coat 2 sizes too big. I'm Emma Henderson, 34, and a freelance writer, a job I was currently failing at, too preoccupied by the burden of memory and the quiet presence of my 8-year-old daughter, Molly. Molly found the silence unsettling. "It's too quiet, Mama," she'd whisper, her bright eyes wide as she looked up at the high ceilings. "It sounds like the house is holding its breath." I tried to be pragmatic. "It's just old, sweetheart. We'll clean it up, make it ours." The real work of making it ours began in the attic. It was a choked space, packed with the detritus of a difficult life. My life, my mother's life. Among the moth-eaten blankets and brittle newspapers, my hand brushed against something cold and strangely smooth. It was a diary. The cover was dark, aged leather, cool to the touch. It looked less like a personal journal and more like a prop from an antique shop. The pages were yellowed and thick. I sat on a dusty trunk and opened it. The handwriting, my mother's spidery precise script, instantly brought a knot of pain to my chest. The first page contained the most chilling entry. "When I first saw him, I understood. We are not alone in this house." I frowned, closing the book briefly. My mother had struggled fiercely with her mental health in her later years. It was a well-known, difficult truth in our family. I told myself this was simply a window into her deterioration, a record of the delusions that had plagued her. I kept reading. Martha detailed minor things at first. The sound of footsteps padding in the hall at night when everyone was asleep. The sensation of a shadow standing behind her in the mirror, only to vanish when she spun around. And an overwhelming, irrational fear of me, her young daughter. I shuddered. It was painful to read, but it confirmed my initial theory, a slow descent into paranoia. But then the quiet, unsettling incidents started happening to me. I was unpacking boxes in the kitchen late one evening, exhausted, when I caught a flicker of movement in the reflection of the dark oven door. A tall, gaunt shadow stood directly behind me. My heart hammered against my ribs and I whipped around, my entire body tense and ready. Nothing. Just the empty, dusty hallway. "It's stress, Emma," I muttered, shaking my head. "It's just the house and the exhaustion." I was determined to dismiss it until Molly began to speak. I found her standing by her bedroom window one night, gazing intently at the shadows cast by the moon. "Molly, what are you doing up?" She turned to me slowly, her usual vibrant energy dimmed by an unnatural seriousness. "Grandma comes into my room, Mama. She's quiet and she just watches me, but her face is wrong. She doesn't have any eyes." A wave of cold washed over me. I pulled her into a hug, whispering reassurances that there were no grandmas without eyes, just bad dreams. But later, lying in bed, I couldn't shake the image. The next morning, I opened the diary again, flipping several pages ahead, determined to find some closure, some explanation for the madness. I stopped at a random page dated 15 years ago. My mother wrote about a dream where the darkness came for my baby girl, whispering from the walls. That very afternoon, while setting up my old desk in the makeshift office, I distinctly heard a muffled, sorrowful sobbing coming from inside the drywall right beside my ear. It was a weeping sound, quiet but persistent, as if a child were trapped beneath the plaster. I didn't call David. I didn't call the police. I just pressed my head to the wall, listening to the terrible, wet sound until it slowly faded back into the wood. The house wasn't just dusty. It was infected. And I was beginning to fear that my mother's illness wasn't what I thought it was. It wasn't just in her mind. It was in the very core of this old, lonely house. And now, I had read the prologue to a horror that felt sickeningly familiar. I knew I shouldn't, but I couldn't stop myself. I was compelled to read the next page, to see what terrifying event lay in store for me tomorrow. The discovery of the crying sound sealed my fate. I didn't just feel fear anymore. I felt a chilling sense of inevitability. The diary was not a chronicle of madness. It was a prophecy. I tried to stop reading, stuffing the dark leather book into a kitchen drawer beneath stacks of mismatched linens. But the house wouldn't let me. One afternoon, I walked into the pantry and found the diary lying open on the floor, the page crumpled, waiting for me. I didn't touch it, but my eyes locked onto the date, October 12th. My mother had written about seeing her own reflection distorted in a window, her face impossibly thin and gray. The next day, October 12th, I was looking out the kitchen window at Molly playing on the lawn, and I saw it. My reflection in the glass was sickly, almost skeletal, and for a terrifying split second my eyes were solid black pools. The distortion lasted less than a breath, but it was long enough. I slammed my hand over my mouth to stifle a scream. The entries weren't just mirroring my experiences, they were setting the schedule. I became frantic, convinced I was losing my mind, just as Martha had. I reached out to a professional, Dr. Ellen Grant, a kind, sharp-witted therapist in the city. "What you're describing, Emma, sounds like classic grief-induced psychosis or perhaps inherited trauma," Dr. Grant suggested gently over the phone. "The diary is simply giving shape to your existing anxieties." She was logical, and her voice was comforting, but the events in the house were now defying logic. Molly's terror was escalating too. Her dreams weren't about her grandmother anymore. They were about the man with the empty eyes that Martha had described seeing in the corners of rooms. One morning, I found Molly sitting on her floor, intently drawing. Her picture was unsettling. A bright, normal crayon house, but dominating the center was a figure with a huge, blackened face with no facial features at all. A swirling vortex of crayon scribbles where the eyes should be. I ran back to the diary, flipping through the old, brittle pages until I found the matching description. It leaves its mark. A child sees its true face, and then the haunting begins. It drew a portrait of itself on the wall today. A black, vacant smear. The entity was demanding to be seen, to be acknowledged as real. The attack became personal. I had skipped 3 consecutive pages, desperate to pause the inevitable. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound I couldn't place. I slowly opened the diary, hoping to find a clue. The current page, the one I had refused to read, now had my name written repeatedly in my mother's frenzied hand, overlapping the original script. Emma, Emma, Emma. But the ink was fresh. It was still dark, glossy, and slightly wet to the touch. I hadn't written that. Martha was dead. Panic gave way to a cold, paralyzing dread. I understood then that this was not merely a record. It was a living document. The entity had found a way to bridge the time between the past and the present, using the book as a conductor. I was no longer reading my mother's story. I was reading my own life as it was being written by the curse. I frantically flipped to the very end. The final, 3/4 of the last page was filled with Martha's final, almost illegible entry, written in fading pencil, describing her ultimate fate, how she had lost her identity, her peace, and her mind. She wrote about the agonizing, slow process of being drained by the void she had discovered. I slammed the book shut, my breath catching in a choked gasp. I had seen enough. The horror was real, and it was waiting. But I knew the diary wasn't finished. I knew the blank space at the bottom of the last page was reserved. It was waiting for the final chapter, my chapter. I didn't need to read the diary anymore. The pages had already become the blueprint of my reality. I had stopped eating, barely sleeping, spending my hours pacing the floor, clutching Molly to me. I knew the entity was tightening its grip, suffocating my sanity just as it had suffocated my mother's. I had to protect Molly, but every exit, every phone line, every attempt to contact the outside world felt blocked by a cold, invisible wall. The house had sealed us in. I was frantic, yet utterly numb. The final entry I had read, my mother's panicked description of losing her soul, was already manifesting in me. I would stare at my reflection and see a stranger with hollowed eyes. Meanwhile, Dr. Grant had grown alarmed. My last phone conversation with her, before the line mysteriously went dead, was riddled with my fragmented confessions about the diary. She hadn't dismissed me entirely. She had promised to follow up, maybe even drive out to the house herself. It was late afternoon when I heard the car pull up outside. I crept to the window and saw Dr. Grant's sedan. Thank God. Hope, sharp and painful, pierced the suffocating dread. I rushed to the front door, but a dense, freezing chill immediately hit me, forcing me back. I was physically incapable of touching the knob. The entity didn't want the door opened. "Emma, are you all right? Open up, please." Dr. Grant called from the porch, her voice muffled but urgent. "I can't," I screamed back, tears of frustration streaming down my face. "I'm locked in. Take Molly." I heard Dr. Grant fumbling with the latch, then silence followed by a sharp, terrified gasp. "Emma, there's a note taped here. It says you left this morning, that you won't be back." I knew what had happened. The diary had written the lie, and the house had enforced it. Panic consumed me. I spun around, searching for Molly. She was in the hallway, standing rigidly, staring at the floor. "Mama," she whispered, her voice deadened, "the man with the empty eyes wants you to finish the story." My gaze was drawn instantly to the side table. The dark leather diary lay there, resting open. The final page was facing up, the empty space at the bottom glowing in the dim light like a hungry mouth. I couldn't resist. My legs moved on their own, guided by a force that was no longer mine. I looked at Martha's last scrawl. "My daughter will read this diary one day. Then she will understand that I couldn't survive it either." It was a final, terrible act of love and warning. I lifted my eyes from the page and saw my reflection in the glass of a framed photograph. My face was pale, my eyes wide. I watched as my hand, rigid and unresponsive to my own will, slowly picked up a pencil from the table. My gaze dropped to the blank space. I watched, horrified, as my fingers began to move, forming the familiar strokes of my own handwriting. The pencil scratched against the old paper, adding the final, inescapable line to the family curse. I saw the words form. They were my words, yet spoken by the darkness that now wore my skin. "It is your turn now, Emma." The moment the pencil lifted from the paper, a cold, intense pressure exploded inside my head. All thought, all identity, all the love for Molly, it was instantly gone. I was empty, peaceful, and utterly possessed. The curse was complete. I carefully closed the diary, placing it neatly beside the photograph. The fear on the other side of the door was still there, muffled, confused. But it no longer concerned me. The last thing I saw, the last fleeting thought of my true self, was in the mirror, hanging just beside the door. I looked straight into the glass, prepared to see the skeletal face or the black eyes of the entity. But there was no face at all. There was only a vacant, blurry shadow where my reflection should have been. The final, empty space left by the woman named Emma Henderson, whose story was now finished.